"Drop the tray, sweetheart," and back away slowly. The man in the trench coat snarled. The barrel of his silencer pointed squarely at Leo's chest. The diner was dead silent, save for the hum of the broken neon sign outside and the harsh drumming of rain against the glass. 4 men, 4 guns, all of them aimed at the man sitting alone in booth 3. Leo didn't flinch. He just kept his hands flat on the sticky formica table, his jaw clenched, calculating his last seconds on Earth. But the gunman didn't account for the terrified, exhausted waitress standing paralyzed in the aisle. They didn't account for the heavy, metallic glint of Leo's discarded pistol resting right by her worn-out sneakers. The rain outside did not merely fall. It assaulted the city, descending in relentless, driving sheets that hammered against the diner's front window with the ferocity of 1,000 tiny fists. The drops fractured the neon light of the open sign, scattering its harsh, buzzing red glare across the cracked asphalt of the parking lot in a fragmented, bleeding mosaic of urban decay. Inside the diner, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of stale coffee, burnt hash browns, and the sour tang of industrial floor cleaner. Aubrey stood behind the worn formica counter. Her weight shifted onto her left leg to spare the blistering ache in her right heel. It was 3:14 a.m. on a Tuesday, the deadest hour of the graveyard shift, and the diner felt less like a restaurant and more like a purgatory for the restless and the lost. Aubrey dragged a damp, frayed rag across the counter, wiping away imaginary crumbs just to keep her hands moving. Her uniform, a pale blue dress that had seen far too many cycles in a cheap laundromat, clung uncomfortably to her shoulders. She was exhausted. It was a bone-deep, spirit-draining fatigue that came from working double shifts 6 days a week, a desperate marathon just to keep the eviction notices off her apartment door. The mechanical hum of the large silver coffee urn was the only steady companion she had in the oppressive silence. The diner was completely empty, save for the elderly line cook dozing on a stool in the back kitchen, completely oblivious to the world beyond his greasy grill. Aubrey sighed, a shaky exhalation that stirred her damp bangs and stared out into the stormy abyss. The streetlights flickered, struggling against the torrential downpour. She mentally calculated her tips for the night, $14.60 in crumpled bills and sticky coins. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. She closed her eyes, letting the rhythmic drumming of the rain lull her into a brief, dangerous half-sleep. Then, the chime above the glass door rang out. It wasn't the usual lazy jingle of a late-night trucker or a drunk stumbling in for a sobering meal. The door was pushed open with a deliberate, forceful shove, the bell clattering sharply against the glass. A gust of freezing wind and horizontal rain violently invaded the diner, scattering a stack of paper napkins off a nearby table. Aubrey's eyes snapped open, her heart performing a sudden, erratic skip. The man who stepped into the harsh, fluorescent light did not belong in a roadside diner at 3 in the morning. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried an undeniable aura of dangerous authority that seemed to alter the air pressure in the room. He wore a midnight blue wool overcoat over a tailored charcoal suit, clothing that spoke of extreme wealth and power. But the elegance was currently marred by the savage weather. His coat was heavily soaked, the expensive fabric clinging to his frame, and rain dripped steadily from his dark, slicked-back hair onto the scuffed linoleum floor. He paused just inside the doorway, his piercing, icy eyes scanning the perimeter of the empty restaurant with the hyper-vigilance of a hunted animal. Aubrey felt a sudden, inexplicable chill race down her spine. This was Leo. She didn't know his name, of course, nor did she know that he was the head of the city's most ruthless crime syndicate. All Aubrey knew was what her survival instincts were screaming at her. This man was trouble, the kind of trouble that swallowed people whole. Leo slowly closed the door behind him, cutting off the howl of the wind. He didn't look at Aubrey, not at first. He walked with heavy, deliberate steps toward the back of the diner, bypassing the comfortable center tables and heading straight for booth 3, the darkest corner. Facing the entrance, his back pressed firmly against the solid brick wall, he slid into the cracked red vinyl seat, the wet wool of his coat making a heavy, squeaking sound. Aubrey swallowed hard, her throat feeling suddenly dry. She gripped the glass coffee pot, her knuckles turning white, and forced herself to step out from behind the safety of the counter. She smoothed her apron with trembling hands, trying to summon a mask of professional indifference. As she approached the booth, the sheer presence of the man became overwhelming. There was a hard, immovable tension radiating off him, a tightly coiled spring ready to snap. His face was a mask of chiseled stone, handsome but marked by the grim realities of a violent life. There was a small, dark smudge on his white collar. Aubrey's breath hitched as she realized it wasn't grease or dirt. It was a single, fresh drop of blood. She stopped beside his table, the steaming coffee pot acting as a fragile shield between them. The diner was silent again, the storm raging outside feeling completely disconnected from the heavy, suffocating atmosphere inside booth 3. Leo finally looked up at her, his dark eyes locking onto hers. They were cold, calculating, and infinitely exhausted. In that fleeting second, Aubrey saw a reflection of her own profound weariness in the eyes of a very dangerous man, setting the stage for a night that would alter the course of both their lives forever. Coffee. Black. Leave the pot, Leo said. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone that barely carried over the sound of the rain, yet it commanded absolute obedience. He didn't smile, and he didn't offer any polite pleasantries. It was a statement of fact, a directive issued by a man who had never been told no in his entire adult life. Aubrey nodded, her throat too tight to manage a spoken reply. She carefully inverted a heavy ceramic mug that sat on the table and poured the steaming dark liquid into it. The bitter, robust aroma of the coffee bloomed in the space between them, a small, earthly comfort in the freezing tension of the diner. She placed the glass carafe on a heat-resistant mat at the edge of the table, making sure her trembling fingers didn't accidentally brush against his soaked sleeve. "Do you need a menu, sir?" Aubrey asked, her voice sounding embarrassingly thin and fragile in the heavy silence. She forced herself to look at him, pushing past the primal urge to avert her gaze from a predator. Leo didn't look at the menu tucked behind the salt and pepper shakers. He kept his eyes fixed entirely on the glass front doors of the diner, his gaze penetrating the rain-streaked darkness outside. "No food," he muttered, reaching into the inner pocket of his ruined suit jacket. He pulled out a thick, heavy money clip that gleamed with polished silver. With a swift, practiced motion, he peeled off a crisp, perfectly flat $100 bill and slid it across the formica table. It came to rest right against Aubrey's hip, for the coffee and for the quiet. Aubrey stared down at the bill. $100. That was more than she made in 3 grueling shifts of carrying heavy trays and suffering the indignities of rude customers. Her immediate instinct was to take it, to shove it deep into her apron pocket, and pay her overdue electric bill. But another, deeper instinct, pride, or perhaps fear, made her hesitate. Taking that kind of money from a man who bled onto his expensive collar felt like signing a dark, invisible contract. "Sir, the coffee is only $1.50, Aubrey said, her voice shaking slightly as she nudged the bill back toward him with a single finger. "I can't make change for this. I don't have enough in the register." Leo finally dragged his attention away from the window and looked at her. Really looked at her. He saw the frayed edges of her uniform, The dark, bruised bags under her eyes, the desperate exhaustion etched into the fine lines around her mouth. He saw a woman who was drowning in the slow, agonizing quicksand of poverty. For a fraction of a second, the hard, icy exterior of the Mafia boss cracked, revealing a flicker of raw human empathy. He recognized a fellow survivor, fighting a very different kind of war. "I didn't ask for change," Leo said, his tone softening imperceptibly, though the danger never truly left his voice. He pushed the bill back toward her, his large, scarred hand covering hers for a fraction of a second. His skin was freezing cold. "Take the money, Aubrey." She flinched. He had read her name tag. It was a simple detail, but coming from him, it felt entirely too intimate. Aubrey slowly withdrew her hand, leaving the bill on the table. She gave a small, jerky nod and took a step back, eager to retreat to the sanctuary behind the counter. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She turned and practically fled down the narrow aisle, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She busied herself behind the counter, vigorously scrubbing a stainless steel sink that was already spotless. She needed to stay busy. She needed to ignore the terrifying man in booth 3. For the next 20 minutes, the diner existed in a suspended state of agonizing limbo. The only sounds were the furious assault of the rain on the roof, the gentle bubbling of the deep fryer in the back kitchen, and the rhythmic metallic clink of Leo's silver spoon hitting the side of his coffee mug. He drank his coffee slowly, methodically, never once breaking his intense vigil over the parking lot. He was waiting for something, or someone. Aubrey watched him covertly through the reflection of the pie case mirror. She noticed the way his shoulders remained entirely rigid, the way his right hand casually rested on his lap, hidden beneath the table. He was a man anticipating extreme violence. The realization made Aubrey's stomach churn with cold dread. She desperately wished the old cook would come out from the back, just to provide a buffer of normalcy. But the kitchen doors remained stubbornly shut. The digital clock on the register glowed a harsh neon green. 3:38 a.m. The storm outside seemed to intensify, the wind howling like a wounded animal, rattling the large plate glass windows in their aluminum frames. The ambient temperature in the diner seemed to plummet, a creeping, unnatural cold that had nothing to do with the weather. It was the chill of impending doom. Leo suddenly stopped stirring his coffee. The spoon froze in the middle of the mug. His entire body went completely rigid, like a hunting dog catching a scent on the wind. Aubrey saw his jaw muscles feather, clenching so tight she thought his teeth might crack. He slowly, deliberately lowered his right hand further under the table, shifting his weight. Aubrey followed his line of sight, turning her head to look out the front windows. The heavy rain obscured most of the parking lot, but through the blurry, distorted glass, she saw them. 2 sleek, black sedans glided silently into the lot, their headlights completely off, moving like sharks cutting through dark water. They parked parallel to the diner, blocking the only exit. The calm before the storm was officially over. The storm had arrived. The diner's front door didn't chime. It violently shattered the fragile quiet. It was yanked open with such brutal force that the hinges screamed in protest, and the small bell above it tore loose from its mounting, clattering uselessly onto the wet floor tiles. The heavy rain blew inside, carrying with it 4 men clad in dark, heavy overcoats. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized precision that immediately marked them as professional killers. There was no hesitation, no scanning of the room. They knew exactly who they were looking for, and they knew exactly where he was sitting. Aubrey was frozen behind the counter. A stack of ceramic saucers clutched desperately to her chest. The air in the diner instantly evaporated, replaced by a thick, suffocating wave of pure, concentrated terror. The men didn't wear masks. They didn't need to. Their faces were impassive, carved from cold stone, their eyes dead and vacant. The man in the lead, a towering figure with a jagged scar cutting through his left eyebrow, reached into his coat and produced a heavy, suppressed handgun. The metal caught the harsh fluorescent light, gleaming with a wicked, deadly intent. The other three men followed suit in perfect unison, drawing their own weapons and fanning out across the diner floor, systematically cutting off every possible angle of escape. "Lock the door. Flip the sign," the scarred man barked, his voice devoid of any human emotion. It was the sound of a machine executing a protocol. One of the gunmen stepped back, twisted the deadbolt on the glass door with a sharp click, and roughly flipped the open sign to closed. The metallic snap of the lock echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. Aubrey felt the blood drain completely from her face. Her knees turned to water, and she slowly, instinctively sank to the floor behind the counter, pulling her knees to her chest, making herself as small and invisible as humanly possible. She was trembling so violently her teeth chattered, a primal, uncontrollable physical reaction to the presence of absolute death. From her hiding spot on the sticky floor mats, Aubrey could only see the lower halves of the men, wet boots, dripping coats, and the terrifying steady stance of executioners. Through the narrow gap beneath the counter, she had a clear, unobstructed view of booth 3. Leo had not moved. He hadn't jumped up, hadn't shouted, hadn't reached for his coat. He remained perfectly seated, his back against the brick wall, his hands resting flat and empty on the Formica table. The only betrayal of his immense stress was the absolute stillness of his body. He was a statue, watching his grim reapers approach. "Hello, Leo," the scarred man said, his heavy boots squeaking as he stopped 10 feet away from the booth. He raised his suppressed pistol, pointing it squarely at Leo's chest. "It's a bad night to be out for a drive. You should have stayed in the city." "It was a bad night," Leo replied, his voice calm, smooth, and chillingly steady. There was no tremor of fear, only a deep, profound weariness. "Until you boys showed up to keep me company." "Who sent you? Carmine? Or did the Russians finally scrape together enough change to afford you?" The scarred man gave a short, humorless chuckle. "Doesn't matter who signed the check, Leo. All that matters is it cleared, and you're severely out of your jurisdiction. Your bodyguards are dead in a ditch off Route 9. It's just you. It's over." Aubrey pressed her hands over her mouth to stifle a whimper. Dead bodyguards. Assassins. This wasn't a robbery. This was a mob execution playing out in her miserable, brightly lit diner. She squeezed her eyes shut, silently begging the universe to wake her up from this nightmare. She prayed the old cook in the back would stay quiet, that these men would just do what they came to do and leave without checking behind the counter. "Over is a subjective term," Leo said smoothly. Aubrey opened her eyes and peeked through the gap again. She saw Leo casually cross his legs under the table. The movement was incredibly smooth, almost imperceptible, but as he shifted, Aubrey saw something metallic slide silently down his pant leg. It hit the floor with a dull, muffled thud that was completely masked by a sudden crack of thunder outside. It was a gun. A compact, black backup pistol. Leo had anticipated the pat-down. He knew that if he drew a weapon against 4 drawn guns, he would be dead before he cleared his holster. He had intentionally dropped his only chance of survival onto the floor. With a microscopic flick of his polished leather shoe, Leo kicked the heavy pistol under the table. It slid smoothly across the slick linoleum floor, shooting out from under the booth and skidding into the narrow aisle. The gun spun twice and came to a dead stop, bumping gently against the base of the counter. Aubrey stared at it. The weapon was resting exactly 2 feet away from her right hand. The metal was cold, dull, and terrifyingly real. It was an instrument of death, sitting directly in her space. She looked from the gun on the floor, past the boots of the assassins, and up to the reflective glass of the pie case. Through the mirror, Aubrey made direct eye contact with Leo. He wasn't looking at the gunman. He was looking at her reflection. His dark eyes were burning with a desperate, intense plea. It wasn't a command. It was a silent, agonizing cry for help. In that split second, the invisible wall between their two worlds shattered. He was no longer a mafia boss, and she was no longer a waitress. They were just two human beings, trapped in a cage with monsters, and the only key to survival was resting on the floor beside her trembling hand. The air in the diner grew completely stagnant, heavy with the metallic tang of adrenaline and wet wool. The scarred man took a step closer to the booth, the silencer of his weapon tracking Leo's every breath. The three other gunmen remained frozen in their tactical positions, their eyes scanning the empty booths and the swinging doors of the kitchen, completely ignoring the space behind the counter where a terrified waitress was currently questioning her own sanity. "Stand up, Leo," the scarred man ordered, his voice echoing sharply off the linoleum. "Keep your hands where I can see them. We're taking a walk out back. No need to make a mess in here." Leo didn't move. He leaned back into the red vinyl, his posture projecting an arrogant defiance that completely belied the desperation Aubrey had just seen in his eyes. "I think I'll stay seated," Leo replied smoothly, picking up his ceramic mug and taking a slow, agonizingly deliberate sip of his black coffee. "My knees aren't what they used to be, and it's pouring out there. If you're going to kill me, you're going to have to do it right here, under the bright lights." The scarred man's jaw tightened. He didn't like this. Professionals preferred the dark, the quiet, the absolute control of a secluded alleyway. A brightly lit diner with large windows bordering a highway was a severe tactical vulnerability. He glanced quickly at the kitchen doors, then back to Leo. "Don't play games," the gunman growled, stepping within arm's reach of the table. "You know how this works. You come quietly, and we make it fast. You resist, and we make it hurt. A lot. Get up, drop the tray, sweetheart, and back away slowly." The words echoed in Aubrey's mind. It wasn't what the gunman was saying now, but it was the reality she felt pressing down on her. From her crouched position behind the counter, the world had shrunk down to three distinct elements: the heavy, rapid thumping of her own heart, the terrifying boots of the men standing just feet away, and the cold, black metal of the pistol lying on the floor beside her hand. She stared at the gun, her mind racing in 100 different directions, none of them rational. She was Aubrey. She was 24 years old. She took night classes at the community college and worried about the price of eggs. She didn't hold guns. She didn't stop assassinations. She poured coffee and scrubbed tables. Her survival instinct, honed by years of living on the edge of poverty, screamed at her to stay down, to cover her ears, to become part of the floorboards. If she stayed hidden, they might just shoot him and leave. If she touched that gun, she would become part of the equation. She would become a target. "I said get up!" the scarred man roared, his sudden burst of anger shattering the tense quiet. He violently backhanded the glass coffee carafe off the table. It hit the floor with an explosive crash, sending shattered glass and scalding black liquid erupting across the aisle. Aubrey flinched, biting down hard on her own lip to stifle a scream as a spray of hot coffee hit her ankle. Leo didn't even blink at the sudden violence. He looked at the shattered glass, then slowly back up to the gunman. "You're making a mess, friend," Leo said softly. "The waitress is going to have to clean that up." "There isn't going to be a waitress," one of the other gunmen said, his voice flat and bored from across the room. "Check the back." Aubrey's blood turned to absolute ice. The command was a death sentence, not just for Leo, but for her, and for the old cook sleeping in the kitchen. They weren't going to leave witnesses. They were professionals. They would execute Leo, then they would sweep the building, executing anyone who had seen their faces. The realization hit Aubrey with the force of a physical blow. Staying hidden was no longer a survival strategy. It was merely choosing the order in which she would die. She looked at the pistol again. It was a compact Glock, heavy, blocky, and incredibly intimidating. It sat there on the dirty linoleum, a silent challenge. Through the pie case mirror, she saw the scarred man raise his weapon, pressing the cold steel of the silencer directly against Leo's forehead. Leo closed his eyes, his breathing slowing down. He had accepted his fate. The game of delay was over. The ultimatum had been delivered, and execution was imminent. "Any last requests, boss?" the scarred man whispered, his finger curling tightly around the trigger. Aubrey's chest heaved. The air felt too thick to breathe. She thought of the old cook, snoring softly by the grill. She thought of Leo, a violent man, perhaps, but a man who had treated her with a strange, quiet dignity. She thought of herself, dying, terrified and alone on a sticky diner floor. A sudden, white-hot spark of pure, unadulterated anger ignited in the pit of her stomach. It burned away the paralyzing terror, replacing it with a desperate, reckless fury. She was sick of being collateral damage. She was sick of the world stomping on her. She reached out, her fingers trembling so violently they were practically vibrating. Her hand closed around the cold, textured grip of the Glock. It was incredibly heavy, far heavier than she imagined from movies. The weight of it grounded her, pulling her out of her panic and into a state of hyper-focused clarity. Aubrey didn't know how to shoot. She didn't know about safeties or recoil or sight alignment. But she knew that holding this weapon was the only thing standing between her and a body bag. She took a deep, jagged breath, her knuckles turning white as she squeezed the grip. The ultimatum had been given. It was time for her response. Time, which had been racing at a sickening speed, suddenly ground to an agonizing, molasses-thick halt. The diner became a diorama, frozen in a terrible tableau. Aubrey crouched behind the counter, the heavy Glock anchored in her trembling hands. The cold steel felt completely alien against her skin, a massive, deadly intrusion into her fragile reality. She stared down the length of the aisle, charting the distance between her hiding spot and the boots of the executioners. The scarred man had the silencer pressed firmly against Leo's forehead. The other three gunmen were shifting, one already turning his shoulders toward the swinging kitchen doors. The sweeping protocol was beginning. The window for action was closing. It wasn't a matter of minutes anymore. It was a matter of milliseconds. Aubrey's mind was a chaotic storm of conflicting impulses. Stay down, you'll die. Stand up, you'll die. The options were completely binary, and both ended in violence. She squeezed her eyes shut for a fraction of a second, seeking a reservoir of courage she wasn't sure existed. She found only desperate, primal defiance. She refused to die, cowering in the smell of old bleach. She pulled the gun closer to her chest, adjusting her grip. Her index finger instinctively curled around the trigger guard, too terrified to actually touch the trigger itself. She didn't know if the weapon had a safety catch, or if it was already cocked, or if it would simply explode in her hands. She had to bank entirely on the element of surprise. These men were calculating machines. They accounted for trained bodyguards, police response times, and armed resistance. They did not account for a 24-year-old waitress with a stolen firearm. "Move," her brain commanded. Now, Aubrey planted her left hand flat against the slick linoleum, using it to push her weight off her bruised knees. The counter above her seemed miles high. Every joint in her body screamed in protest, tight with adrenaline and fear. She moved with agonizing slowness, hyper-aware of every sound she made. The rustle of her cheap uniform fabric sounded like a hurricane in her own ears. As she rose, her line of sight breached the edge of the counter. She saw the back of the scarred man's dark coat, broad and impenetrable. She saw Leo's face, pale and taut, his eyes closed in grim acceptance of the bullet that was about to end his life. Aubrey didn't aim the gun. She didn't take a shooter's stance. She simply stood straight up, gripping the heavy pistol with both hands, extending her arms straight out in front of her like a shield. Her entire body was shaking with the violence of an earthquake, the gun barrel dancing wildly in the air, pointing generally in the direction of the hit squad. She took a massive, shuddering breath, filling her lungs to capacity. She needed to break the silence. She needed to shatter the executioner's focus. "Hey!" Aubrey screamed. The word tore from her throat, raw, jagged, and piercingly loud. It wasn't a heroic command. It was the hysterical, desperate shriek of a terrified civilian, pushed past the absolute limit of her endurance. The sound ricocheted off the tiled walls, slicing through the heavy tension of the diner like a physical blade. The reaction was instantaneous and violently chaotic. The scarred man, his nervous system wired for combat, physically flinched at the unexpected noise from behind him. The silencer jerked a fraction of an inch away from Leo's skull. The other three gunmen whipped around, their weapons snapping toward the source of the sound, their eyes wide with sudden, jarring shock. For one perfectly suspended second, the four professional killers simply stared. Their tactical brains desperately tried to process the impossible visual information before them. They had locked the door. They had secured the room. Yet, standing behind the counter, illuminated by the flickering fluorescent lights, was a waitress in a stained blue dress. She was pale as a ghost, tears streaming down her face, holding a heavy caliber Glock with both hands. She looked completely unhinged, her arms shaking so badly the gun was a blur. That unpredictability was her greatest weapon. A trained shooter was a known quantity. You knew how they would stand, how they would fire. A terrified amateur holding a gun with a white-knuckled death grip was a chaotic nightmare. They didn't know if she was going to drop it, shoot herself, or pull the trigger in a wild, sweeping panic. "Drop it!" one of the gunmen yelled, his own voice cracking slightly with surprise as he leveled his weapon at her chest. Aubrey didn't drop it. She couldn't. Her fingers were locked in a tetanic spasm around the grip. She let out another sound, a half-sob, half-scream of pure adrenaline. She closed her eyes tightly and, acting entirely on blind, panicked instinct, jerked both of her hands upward. She didn't pull the trigger. She didn't know how to shoot. But the sudden, violent upward motion of the gun in the hands of a screaming civilian was enough. "Look out!" the scarred man barked, instinctively ducking and pulling his weapon away from Leo to cover his own torso, expecting a wild, uncontrollable spray of bullets. The other men stepped back, breaking their tactical formation, their attention completely derailed by the hysterical woman behind the counter. The execution was interrupted. The unbreakable focus of the hit squad was shattered. The diorama was broken. And in that chaotic, beautiful 3-second window of absolute distraction, Leo opened his eyes. The predator had been given an opening, and the waiting game was violently over. The sudden shift in the diner's atmosphere was violently jarring, like a vacuum seal shattering. The 3 seconds of stunned disbelief caused by Aubrey's desperate scream were all Leo needed. His transition from passive victim to lethal predator was instantaneous and terrifying to behold. The scarred man, his weapon now aimed defensively toward the trembling waitress, never saw the strike coming. Leo didn't reach for a weapon. He became one. With a roar of exertion, he planted his heavy boots on the floor and launched his entire body weight forward. His hands grabbed the heavy, bolted-down Formica table, and with a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength that defied physics, he ripped it upward. The metal bolts screamed as they tore free from the linoleum. The heavy table flipped end over end, acting as a massive, improvised battering ram. It crashed brutally into the scarred man and the gunman standing next to him. The sheer weight and force of the impact drove the breath from their lungs, knocking them violently backward into the adjacent booths. A cacophony of shattering glass, splintering wood, and human grunts exploded in the enclosed space. The scarred man's gun discharged into the ceiling as he fell, a deafening crack that showered the room with drywall dust and plaster. Aubrey flinched violently at the gunshot, her eyes snapping open. She stood frozen, still gripping the Glock with white knuckles, watching the absolute chaos unfold in front of her. The diner had instantly transformed into a war zone. The remaining two gunmen recovered from their shock, swinging their weapons back toward Leo. But Leo was already moving. He vaulted over the flipped table with the agility of a much younger man, closing the distance before they could acquire a target. He grabbed the nearest gunman by the lapels of his heavy coat, using the man's own momentum against him, and hurled him violently into the glass pie case. The thick glass shattered outward in a spectacular explosion of sharp fragments and ruined pastries. The man crumpled to the floor, disoriented and bleeding from superficial cuts. Leo didn't pause to admire his work. He spun around, his eyes locking onto Aubrey, who was still standing paralyzed behind the counter, the gun shaking in her hands. He saw the sheer, unadulterated terror consuming her. She had saved his life, but now she was a massive, vulnerable target, standing in the open. "Aubrey!" Leo bellowed, his voice cutting through the ringing in her ears. He sprinted toward the counter, moving faster than a man his size had any right to. "Give me the gun!" Aubrey blinked, her brain struggling to process the command. She looked down at the heavy weapon in her hands, then back at Leo, who was practically flying toward her. Behind him, the scarred man was groggily pushing the heavy table off his chest, his eyes burning with lethal fury, raising his weapon for a clear shot. "The gun! Toss it!" Leo roared, reaching his hand across the counter. Aubrey didn't throw it. She was too terrified of dropping it and causing it to fire. Instead, she practically lunged forward, slamming the heavy grip of the pistol directly into Leo's outstretched palm. The moment the weapon touched Leo's flesh, the entire dynamic of the room changed completely. The gun ceased to be a clumsy weight and instantly became an extension of his arm. He didn't even look down to check the safety or his grip. He grabbed Aubrey by the collar of her cheap uniform and violently yanked her down behind the safety of the heavy stainless steel counter, just as a suppressed bullet punched through the space where her head had been a fraction of a second earlier. The bullet struck the large coffee urn behind her, tearing through the thin metal. Scalding water and coffee erupted into the air, hissing and spraying violently across the counter. "Stay down! Do not move!" Leo commanded, his voice a harsh whisper right next to her ear. Aubrey curled into a tight ball, her hands covering her ears, sobbing uncontrollably. The noise was unbearable. She could hear the heavy thud of boots slipping on the wet floor, the suppressed psh-psh-psh of incoming fire tearing through the diner's cheap wooden paneling, raining splinters down on her. Leo rose into a crouch. He didn't fire blindly. He waited for a break in the incoming fire. When the scarred man paused for a fraction of a second to adjust his footing, Leo snapped upright. He fired 2 rapid, deafening shots from the Glock. He didn't aim to kill. He aimed to suppress. The heavy bullet slammed into the heavy support pillar right next to the scarred man's head, showering him in concrete dust and forcing him to dive for cover. "We move now," Leo shouted over the ringing in Aubrey's ears. He grabbed the back of her uniform, physically hauling her up from the floor. "Kitchen! Go! Go! Go!" Aubrey stumbled forward, her legs feeling like rubber. She didn't think. She just reacted to the massive force pulling her forward. They sprinted down the narrow walkway behind the counter, slipping on the coffee-slick floor. Leo stayed physically between her and the hit squad, using his own body as a moving shield, firing backward over his shoulder to keep the gunman pinned down. The swinging metal doors of the kitchen loomed ahead. It was their only way out, the only sanctuary in a room that had rapidly become a slaughterhouse. They hit the doors together, bursting through them in a chaotic tangle of limbs and sheer panic. They crashed through the swinging metal doors with the force of a runaway train, the heavy hinges screaming in protest. The bright, stark, white light of the kitchen was a blinding contrast to the dim, moody lighting of the dining area. The air back here was thick, heavy, and slick with the smell of old grease and raw onions. Aubrey stumbled, her rubber-soled shoes losing traction on the perpetually slick, greasy tiles. She went down hard, her bruised knees slamming into the floor, scraping against the harsh grit. She gasped. The wind knocked completely out of her lungs. "Get up," Leo barked, his voice devoid of any sympathy, operating purely on survival mechanics. He didn't stop to help her immediately. He spun around, leveling the Glock at the swinging doors they had just burst through. He stood with feet planted wide, completely exposed, providing covering fire. He squeezed the trigger twice. The deafening roar of the unsuppressed weapon in the confined, tiled space was agonizingly loud, vibrating right through Aubrey's chest cavity. The bullets punched through the small square windows of the doors, shattering the safety wire glass to ensure nobody was immediately following them. In the corner, by the deep fryers, the old cook, Marcus, was standing frozen, holding a pair of metal tongs. His eyes were wide with sheer terror, his jaw slack, completely failing to comprehend the violent explosion that had just invaded his quiet sanctuary. "Marcus, out the back! Run!" Aubrey screamed, finding her voice through the panic. She scrambled to her feet, ignoring the sharp, burning pain in her knees. The old man finally snapped out of his trance. He dropped the tongs, turned, and bolted for the heavy steel delivery door at the back of the kitchen. He hit the push bar with his entire body weight, throwing the door open to the howling storm outside, and vanished into the pouring rain without looking back. "Help me block the door," Leo ordered, his eyes still locked on the swinging entrance. Aubrey nodded frantically. She scrambled toward a heavy, commercial-grade stainless steel prep table. It was mounted on casters, but the wheels were locked and rusted with years of accumulated grease. She grabbed the edge and pushed with every ounce of strength she possessed, her cheap shoes slipping against the floor. Leo took a step backward, keeping his weapon raised, and slammed his free shoulder into the table alongside her. The combined force broke the rust. The heavy metal table shrieked loudly as it scraped across the tiles, crashing violently against the swinging doors, effectively barricading them. Almost immediately, heavy bodies slammed into the other side of the doors. The metal buckled slightly under the impact, but the prep table held firm. Muffled curses and the sound of suppressed gunfire hammering against the heavy wood echoed from the dining room. "It won't hold them long. They'll blow the hinges," Leo said, his breathing heavy but controlled. He grabbed Aubrey's arm, his grip bruisingly tight. "We're leaving." He dragged her toward the open back door, out into the raging tempest. The transition from the stifling heat of the kitchen to the freezing, relentless downpour was a brutal shock to the system. The cold rain hit Aubrey like a physical blow, instantly soaking through her thin uniform, plastering her hair to her face. They burst into the dark, narrow alley behind the diner. It was a suffocating canyon of brick and rusted dumpsters filled with the stench of wet garbage and overflowing drains. The wind howled violently through the corridor, making it difficult to even stand upright. "Which way?" Leo shouted over the storm, his eyes scanning the pitch-black alleyway for movement. "Left! The street is left!" Aubrey screamed back, pointing blindly into the dark. They sprinted. Aubrey's lungs burned, begging for air she couldn't catch. Her legs felt heavy and sluggish, but pure, unadulterated fear kept her moving forward. Every shadow looked like a man with a gun. Every gust of wind sounded like a footstep. Suddenly, the piercing, shrill wail of police sirens cut through the sound of the storm. It was distant at first, then rapidly growing louder, multiplying. The gunshots in the diner, the shattered glass, the old cook escaping someone had called it in, or the patrol cars had heard the unsuppressed fire from Leo's weapon. Leo skidded to a halt abruptly, pulling Aubrey behind the massive, foul-smelling bulk of a commercial dumpster. He pressed her back tightly against the cold, wet brick wall and stood over her, his body acting as a protective barrier. He raised the Glock, aiming it back down the alley toward the diner's back door. They waited in agonizing silence, the sirens growing deafeningly loud. The red and blue strobe lights began to reflect off the low-hanging rain clouds, painting the wet brick walls in harsh, alternating colors. The back door of the diner banged open again, but nobody came out. The hit squad was professional. They knew when a job was blown. With the police swarming the front, they wouldn't risk a shootout in a trapped alleyway. They were scattering, melting away into the storm to avoid capture. Leo slowly lowered the gun, leaning his head back against the brick wall. He closed his eyes, and for the first time all night, let out a long, ragged exhale. The immediate threat was gone. They had survived. Aubrey slid down the rough brick wall until she hit the wet asphalt, pulling her knees tightly to her chest. The adrenaline that had kept her moving was violently crashing out of her system, leaving behind a profound, paralyzing shock. She began to hyperventilate, her entire body shaking uncontrollably in the freezing rain. She buried her face in her hands, the reality of the last 10 minutes finally crashing down on her like a physical weight. The alley was a symphony of chaos. The relentless drumming of the rain, the howling wind, and the now deafening chorus of police sirens swarming the front of the diner created a wall of sound. Yet, behind the rusted dumpster, the space between Leo and Aubrey felt profoundly isolated, an intimate vacuum carved out of the storm. Aubrey sat in the filthy puddles, her teeth chattering so violently she thought they might crack. The freezing water soaked through her thin dress, numbing her skin, but she couldn't feel the cold. All she could feel was the phantom weight of the heavy Glock in her hands, the terrifying roar of the gunfire, and the horrible, paralyzing realization that she had actively participated in a lethal standoff. She clamped her hands over her ears, squeezing her eyes shut, trying to block out the memory of the scarred man's face. The shattering glass, the absolute proximity of death. Leo watched her in silence for a long moment. He smoothly ejected the magazine from the pistol, checked the chamber, and slid the weapon back into its concealed holster with the practiced ease of a man putting away a wallet. He looked down at his expensive, ruined suit, now covered in grease, plaster dust, and soaked in rain. He ran a hand over his face, wiping away the grimy water, and slowly crouched down until he was at eye level with the trembling waitress. He didn't touch her. He knew better than to physically crowd someone in the throes of severe shock. "Aubrey," Leo said. His voice was no longer the gravelly command of a crime boss, nor the desperate shout of a man fighting for his life. It was remarkably soft, almost gentle, a deep, resonant tone designed to anchor a panicking mind. She didn't respond. Her shoulders heaved with silent, jagged sobs. "Aubrey, look at me," he commanded softly. putting a slight edge of authority back into his tone to break through her panic spiral. Slowly, agonizingly, she lowered her hands from her face and looked at him. Her eyes were wide, bloodshot, and wide, with residual terror. Mascara ran down her cheeks in dark, watery streaks, mixing with the rain. She looked incredibly young, fragile, and utterly broken. "You're breathing," Leo said. His dark eyes locked onto hers with intense, unwavering focus. "Your heart is beating. You are completely unhurt. Do you understand? It's over. You made it." Aubrey let out a ragged, choking laugh that sounded entirely devoid of humor. I held a gun," she stammered, her voice shaking violently. "I held a gun on them. They were going to kill you, and I picked it up. I don't know why I picked it up. I'm just a waitress. I should have stayed down. I should have just hid. If you had stayed down, we would both be dead right now," Leo stated factually, his voice carrying no dramatic flair, just the cold, hard truth. "They weren't going to leave witnesses. They were a sweeping crew. You knew that. I didn't want to die," she cried out, her voice cracking over the sound of the rain. "But I didn't want to watch them execute you either. You were just sitting there. You gave up. I saw it in your eyes." "Why did you just give up?" Leo flinched slightly, the observation hitting him harder than a physical blow. He looked away, staring down the dark, rain-swept alley. The harsh red and blue strobes of the police cruisers bounced off the wet brick, illuminating his face in harsh, unforgiving light. For a man who controlled empires, admitting defeat was a foreign, bitter taste. "Because I was tired, Aubrey," Leo confessed, his voice dropping to a barely audible rasp. It was an admission he had never made to another living soul. "I've been running from guns for 20 years. You get to a point where the fight just drains out of you." When they walked through that door, I was exhausted. I was ready to let it end. He turned his gaze back to her, a profound sense of awe mingling with the shadows in his eyes. And then a civilian, a waitress making minimum wage, decided that an execution was unacceptable on her shift. "You didn't even know how to hold the damn thing, but you stood up anyway." Aubrey swallowed hard, her shivering slowing down slightly as the grounding reality of the conversation pulled her back from the edge. I was terrified. "Courage isn't the absence of terror," Leo said softly, leaning back against the cold dumpster. "It's taking action while the terror is eating you alive. What you did in there, I have men on my payroll who wouldn't have had the nerve to pull that stunt. You saved my life. I just wanted them to stop," Aubrey whispered, looking down at her scraped, bleeding knees. "I just wanted the diner to be quiet again." "It will be," Leo promised, his tone hardening into an absolute vow. "You survived the storm. Now, I have to ensure you survive the aftermath." He looked toward the street. The sounds of heavy boots and static-filled radios indicated the police were beginning to secure the perimeter. The window for a quiet exit was rapidly closing. The dynamic was shifting back. The moment of shared humanity in the alleyway was ending. He had to become the ghost again, and she had to return to her life. But he was determined that her life would never be the same miserable struggle it had been hours ago. The chaotic sounds of the police securing the front of the diner grew louder, a cacophony of shouting voices, slamming car doors, and harsh radio squawks. The red and blue lights flashing against the alley walls became more frenetic, casting long, erratic shadows across the wet pavement. Leo stood up smoothly, his posture instantly shifting back to the guarded, dangerous stance of a man who lived his life constantly hunted. He brushed the heavy plaster dust and wet grime from his expensive overcoat, though the garment was ruined beyond repair. He looked down at Aubrey, who was still huddled on the cold ground, though her violent trembling had subsided into exhausted, rhythmic shivers. "I can't be here when they sweep the back," Leo said quietly, his voice cutting clearly through the ambient noise of the storm. "If the police find me, it gets complicated. For me and for you. The men who came into the diner tonight, they won't come back here. They failed. Their contract is burned, and they'll be running for their own lives now. You are safe." Aubrey slowly looked up at him. The man standing before her was a terrifying figure, a literal boss of the underworld. But in this specific moment, he was the only anchor she had to sanity. "What do I tell them?" she asked, her voice raspy and weak. "The police." "What do I say?" "You tell them the truth," Leo instructed firmly. "You tell them 4 armed men came in looking for a customer. You hid behind the counter. The customer fought back, threw a table, and escaped out the back. You tell them you didn't see faces, you didn't hear names, and you have no idea who I am. You are a terrified civilian who survived a crossfire. That is your story, and you never deviate from it." Aubrey nodded slowly, absorbing the instructions. It was a simple story, mostly true, and easy to remember under the pressure of an interrogation. Leo reached inside his ruined coat. He bypassed the empty shoulder holster and reached deep into a hidden interior pocket. He pulled out a thick, heavy bundle wrapped in tight rubber bands. It was entirely composed of crisp $100 bills. He crouched back down, took Aubrey's cold, damp hand, and pressed the massive stack of cash firmly into her palm. Aubrey gasped, instinctively trying to pull her hand away. It was an obscene amount of money, a brick of currency that felt as heavy as a cinder block. No, I can't take this. I didn't do it for money." "I know you didn't," Leo said, his grip tightening around her hand, forcing her to hold it. "You did it because you have a good soul. But good souls don't pay the rent, Aubrey. They don't buy new shoes, and they don't get you out of this God-forsaken graveyard shift." He looked directly into her eyes, his expression fierce and intensely sincere. "This isn't a reward. This is a debt. A life debt. There is enough here to quit this job tonight. Pay off your debts. Move to a better apartment. Finish your classes. Whatever you need to do to get out of the deep end." Aubrey stared at the money, tears welling up in her eyes again, blurring her vision. It was freedom. It was the terrifying immediate end to the crushing anxiety that had ruled her entire adult life. It was heavy, illicit, and completely life-changing. "What about you?" she whispered, looking up at him. "Where do you go?" "I go to work," Leo replied grimly. "I have to clean up a mess. But I want you to listen to me very carefully. You will never see me again. But if you ever find yourself in trouble, real trouble, you go to the old newsstand on 5th and Main. You tell the old man behind the counter that Leo owes you a favor. The world will move to fix your problem. Do you understand?" Aubrey nodded, completely overwhelmed, clutching the brick of cash to her wet chest like a lifeline. "I understand." "Good." Leo stood up, stepping back into the deeper shadows of the alley. The rain seemed to swallow him instantly, his dark clothing blending perfectly with the night. He paused for one final second, looking at the exhausted, terrified, impossibly brave waitress. "Take care of yourself, Aubrey, and buy a better lock for your door." With that, he turned and vanished into the storm, moving with the silent, lethal grace of a ghost. Aubrey sat alone in the rain for a few moments longer, the heavy stack of money pressed against her pounding heart. She listened to the approaching footsteps of the police officers, cautiously making their way down the alley. She slowly pushed herself up from the wet asphalt, wincing at the pain in her bruised knees. She smoothed her ruined apron, took a deep, steadying breath of the freezing air, and walked out into the flashing red and blue lights to start her new life. Courage rarely arrives in armor. It usually shows up in a stained uniform on the worst night of your life. Aubrey didn't ask to be a hero, but when the shadows of the underworld breached her reality, she refused to let darkness win. Her impulsive, terrifying act of defiance saved a life and irrevocably changed her own, proving that even in a world ruled by monsters,